So, as the fan hopefully helps to indicate, a couple of years ago, I identified as like gender fluid or non-binary or whatever. As you can tell, I'm not one for rigid terminology. But I suppose neither are non-binary people. And during that period of time, I suppose you could say the primary motivator was the freedom of it, the looseness. I've said before that I'm pretty against I'm pretty for deterritorialization. I'm against the rigidity of ideological territorial boundaries, and so I like taking ideas out of one and into another. So the looseness of gender fluid or non-binary, of doing whatever you want, the chaotic nature of that appealed to me. I think that's one thing that the modern left-right divide kind of misses about people dispositionally, is I was the kid saying slurs, and I was also the kid cross-dressing. That was the same kid. Those were both me at my school, right? And the normal people didn't do either of those things, right? They didn't do either of those. They did none of the cross-dressing, and they were very polite and civil, and they said the things they were supposed to say. So it's weird that you get into politics, and you get suddenly there are people who are hard into right-wing politics, and they say slurs, and they're like, I don't care who gets offended, I don't care, I'll say whatever words I want to say, and then you go into the left-wing politics, and they're cross-dressing, and they're like, oh, I don't care, my pronouns are fucking you, right? The same kind of underlying dispositional rebelliousness is in both of them, and it's weird that never gets talked about. But additionally, one of the things that really drew me in was the sense of community. I say community here in hard scare quotes, because the community was completely digital, completely online, and I'm not a big fan of the idea that an online community is a real community, but it was TikTok for me, and that's a little bit better. I think it's a little bit better than a Discord server or something like that. Well, it's a little bit better than Twitter, because you're just seeing blurbs of text on something like Twitter. When you're seeing full videos of people being a person talking to you, it's a little bit more depthful, and it just felt a little bit more human, a little bit more real. I felt like I knew them a little bit more. And the sheer level of interaction and overlap these people had with one another, the directness of the inside jokes and the spread that they had, drew me in. I wanted to be in on the joke, right? So that was one of the things that drew me in. One of the other things that drew me in was the sort of the horniness, frankly. The horniness of it all. Everybody on there, everybody horny. Everybody horny all the time. In all directions. And freely, in a way that, again, not a big polite society guy, in a way that polite society frowns upon. I think part of that was it's the internet, and there's a little bit more, removal, right? You can be a little bit more horny on the internet because no one's ever going to violate someone too much, because they can't touch you. I think that's part of it. So the most they could do is say, damn, you looking good. And that's a little bit more removed, right? So it's the internet, and everybody's horny. But what was refreshing was that, and this is a difficult thing to say, sort of, men, were getting to be horny. And men in this context, of course, it means a different thing. right? I guess you could say people who were born male, assigned male at birth, biologically male, a lot of different words. None of them are really allowed in the trans community anymore. Let's take a moment and asterisk that point before we move on here. Yeah, because there is a terminology problem in this whole conversation. And this video in particular is weighed down by terminology. I'm very deliberately eschewing politically correct terminology because I don't think this subject can be talked about with it. That's the problem, is that it can't be talked about with it. Terminologically, right, at some point, it probably would have been very socially acceptable to say, biologically male, identifies as female, refer to that person by preferred pronouns, refer to that person politely, generally, and respect their identity overall, but still use that word, biologically male, in certain niche cases in order to reference that aspect of themselves and of their lives. Probably would have been socially acceptable at one point. And then came in people who don't like trans people, generally. This is a broad category. It could mean a bunch of different things. But let's lump it together, because it makes it simpler to explain the bigger concept here. Anti-trans. Gonna put that over here. Pro-trans. Gonna put that over here. Gonna make it very simple, okay? The anti-trans lumped together group started using those words very pointedly, right? To sort of emphasize the biological aspect over all else. And pretty soon biological male started to feel like an accusation more than just a set of facts. But underlyingly that is correct. And nobody disagrees that that's correct. Trans people don't disagree that that's correct. Which is something the right wing seems to not understand. They're not delusional. They know. How could you not know? You gotta be aware of the body you were born into. In fact, they're the most aware of the body they were born into, because it keeps them up at night, the fact that they were born into that body, So, obviously, there's nothing wrong with the acknowledgement that that aspect of them is a part of them. The biological aspect is a part of them. But then it became like a pointed accusation. So then the community stopped liking those terms. Stopped liking biological male, biological female. And so then you get assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, which is a little bit more woke, you could say, right? A little bit more, because now we're talking about people being assigned a gender when they're born. So now we're really leaning into the social constructionism in the terminology. We're putting the social constructionism in the term itself. When you say the term, you are implying a social constructionist theory. And then that one became not woke anymore. Yes, because there are now people saying that AMAB and AFAB is, quote, the new gender binary. So in other words, within queer community and within spaces where there's a lot of trans people, a lot of non-binary people, people have started using AMAB and AFAB to refer back to what people were born as for certain purposes. And this got to a point where I had a friend who identified as non-binary, but was, let's say, biologically female or assigned female at birth, right? And they were trying to refer to their partner, who was also non-binary, but who was assigned male at birth or biologically male. They were trying to talk about them being sexist, right? That they had done something sexist. And they were unable to communicate it because they didn't know what words to use. I remember we were literally driving a car and they were stuttering over themselves. They're like, he, but no, I mean, but they, well, they, so, because I'm a girl, no, but I'm not a girl, right? It's just like tripping over the language to try to express a very simple thought, which was that they were born female, their partner was born male, and there's still an aspect of that genderedness to the relationship, and within that, he did something that she felt was sexist. That they both felt was sexist. Do you see the problem here? So notice this problem of the emphasis on terminology making it impossible to communicate things like sexism. This is actually one of the concerns that, again, getting lots of terminology, that TERFs care about. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists. That's an acronym. Or you could say gender critical. They say TERF is a slur. They like gender critical. People who dislike them prefer the term TERF. But the term TERF only literally means trans-exclusionary radical feminist. And that's entirely accurate. Their worldview is that feminism requires a fundamental emphasis on biological sex differences so that you can communicate that sexism has taken place, and so that you can have what they would call, women-only spaces, like maybe a battered women's shelter. These are feminists who are very concerned with the state of spaces like battered women's shelters, and don't want men there as trans women, right? The point here today is not to endorse that position. I don't endorse that position. The point here is that I feel like liberals' understanding of them is a little bit lacking. Most liberals I've heard talk about them, the way they talk about them is as just like a fascist hate group, which is like the easiest way to just lump them together with all your other enemies. Just be like, oh, well, they're fascists. And, they're not entirely wrong. I'm sure that they fund various anti-trans causes, and in a sense you could say that makes them a hate group. From that perspective. But I do think there's aspects of what they think that do point to real sort of challenges, at least, amongst queer people or trans people or what have you. And that leads me back to what drew me into identifying as non-binary early on, right? What drew me to want to identify as non-binary? It was seeing people, men like me, get to be horny. And all you had to do to be a little bit more direct than men are usually allowed to be. Because let's be real here. Men can't walk up to random women and be like, damn, nice tits. Can't do that. It's socially unacceptable. It's piggish. It comes off as misogynistic and piggish, right? And that restraint has always been very frustrating for me as a fundamentally honest, direct, probably autistic person. I haven't always had the easiest time being indirect with people about sex, so it would really be nice for me to not be immediately seen as a piggish misogynist when I'm being direct and open about stuff like that, right? And apparently all I had to do was identify differently, right? Because you go into these communities and these spaces, and there are trans women being that openly horny towards cis women, and it's kind of fine because it's women and women, and there's just a different set of rules for lesbians than there is for men when it comes to the way they behave towards women. And so the part of the totality of accepting trans people's identity is accepting trans women as women, and then within that framework there's a loosening of the rules around how directly horny they can be, right? So there's sort of two directions you could take this. And I feel like the left hasn't realized there are two directions to take it, and they haven't chosen one, and they also don't even talk about it. They don't even talk about the tension here. One direction you could take this is the gender critical direction. This is a branch of feminists who have basically said these are men hiding as women to allow them room to be sexist. That's sort of the cultural aspect. They also have a lot of ideas about policy, right? But on a cultural level, that's the fear. The fear is they basically agree with men should not be allowed to be openly horny towards women. They fundamentally agree with that. And so when they see men identifying as women, and again, using simplest terminology here, not to, right, men identifying as women and then being sexist or horny, and that's sexist. They reject the transness. They're like, no, this is a mask. This is a mask you can hide behind as a man in order to be objectified of women. That's the term they would use, objectified. The other way to take it is to say, wow, you know, if we really commit to this non-binary stuff, it can truly be freeing. Because if you really commit to the let's get rid of all gender roles shit, then that includes the woke parts of gender roles. Because there's two sets of gender roles. There's the gender roles that you get from like traditional conservatives, right? There's the a man is this way, a woman is this way, traditional conservative gender roles, just because they are, right? And then there's a man has to be this way in order to be seen as respectful towards women in a society where they need to acknowledge women's oppression and the history of patriarchy. That set of gender roles, which gets imposed pretty much exclusively upon men as a way of protecting women from misogyny. And non-binary has the potential to free you from both of those things. And so that's sort of what drew me in. So let's talk about the second problem. The second problem is the inherent tension between fixed sexual orientation and non-fixed gender identity. Within these spaces where you're trying to break down gender roles and just be a person and not be a man or a woman or anything like that, just be whatever you happen to be. Within that, sexual orientation now needs to get altered too. And this can go for anybody, right? So let's say that you are a gay man, okay? And you go out to the club and you're a gay man. And you meet somebody there who identifies as non-binary. But they're AFAB, let's say, you know, assigned female at birth. So they have a vagina, right? And maybe some other feminine features left over from that. But they've masked up a little bit. Maybe they're a little bit androgynous. And they ask you if you're interested, right? If you're interested in hanging out or going on a date or having sex or whatever, right? They're flirting, right? And you try to be like, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I'm a gay man. And now it's well, they don't identify as a man. They don't identify as a man. They also don't identify as a woman. So they're neither. And you're trying to get across that to you, they look like a woman. But to say what someone looks like can be rude, right? Like, if they're trying to look more like a man, and you say they look like a woman, that's an insult. Like a trans woman, if I walked up to a trans woman and like, you look like a man, that would probably be seen as an insult, right? So it leaves him in kind of a bad position as a gay man trying to get across that he's not attracted to this person. And you can see the same sort of thing in other circles too. I'm straight. I've had sex with men, but I didn't like it. And at this point, I'm really only interested in women. I never wanted men on a romantic level, and I'm really only interested in somebody I want on a romantic level at this point. So I'm interested in women. That's what I'm looking for. But when you're on the left, there are no women. Because everyone's non-binary. Everybody is a she, they, or a he, they. So there are no women. So, as a straight guy, there are things that you lose. You lose the ability to refer to the person you're attracted to by the pronouns you were used to when you thought about what you would have as a partner growing up. You lose the ability to say, this is my girlfriend. And that kind of sucks. That's a big part of the problem. And I've seen people even on the left, they're pushing kind of in the other direction. Saw a stand-up comedian one time, and this stand-up comedian had a joke, and the joke was something about like how frustrating it is for straight guys to want to see her as a woman even though she identifies as non-binary, but she still used she, her pronouns and they, them pronouns, which kind of gave people the option of saying she if they wanted. And then guys would always want to say she, and she found that frustrating because they want to put her in that female category. And she wants to be kind of both or kind of neither, but the part of her they're attracted to is the female part of her. And so I think subconsciously, this is why one of the sort of popular talking points about trans women becomes trans women are forcing lesbians to want to date them. Right? That's become like a thing. Like there are people out there who will say, I have no problem with trans people identifying how they want to identify. I don't want to fuck them. And they're like, and people, it's like, that's, and liberal people will sometimes be confused. They'll act confused by this. They'll be like, that's fine. You don't have to fuck them. No one's making you fuck them. You know, right? And they're like, but they are trying to make me fuck them. And they're like, did someone come up to you in real life? A real trans woman, like, came up to you at a bar in real life and was like, you have to fuck me. I'm a woman. No, probably not. Like, that's absurd. Of course that's not what's happening. Maybe, if you're a lesbian, maybe a trans woman asked you out at some point, you know, or flirted with you. Maybe. I can see that happening. But I doubt that that's really the root of the talking point, is that all of these people have real experiences in real life with trans people, like, trying to convince them to be interested. I think it's much more likely that what's actually happening is that these people are just sort of noticing the inherent tension between the fact that they have an innate sexual orientation, whether that's a straight guy being like, I don't want to fuck trans women, they're dudes, they have dicks, right? Or a lesbian being like, well, but I'm attracted to women, and I'm sorry, but you just don't look enough like a woman for me to be attracted to you. Regardless of which that is, they're noticing that tension, and then they're sort of Angry Jack effect, imagining someone else, like, actually trying to make them be attracted to them. They're, like, noticing the tension there, and that's what's sort of driving things. So I think there's a fundamental tension. I guess what I'm saying is sort of a couple of big things. The big thing number one is we need to get a little bit looser with terminology. Because a lot of everything I just talked about is very hard to talk about within any kind of terminology, whether it's woke or anti-woke. Because the anti-wokes have their own terminology, right? They refuse to refer to a woman who isn't trans as cis, even though, what's the alternative? A normal woman? Is that the alternative? You're gonna be like trans women and then women who are actually women? Like no, that's clearly not gonna. Clearly, the opposite group of people is not gonna feel respected by that. Like why are you dying on this hill? And if we stop dying on terminological hills, maybe we could actually talk about actual things like policy and culture. And if we're actually talking about policy and culture, maybe we could actually change some people's minds instead of just yelling at each other about pronouns. But in addition to that sort of language point about how I don't believe in rigid language choices, I also think that there are two fundamental tensions that need to be resolved about transness and about non-binary people and about queerness. And one of those tensions is the tension between identity and the ability to, in some way, be sexist. Right? That's that first one I talked about. And the tension between sexual orientation and how the person you're attracted or not attracted to identifies. And if we can figure out how to navigate those culturally, if we can figure out a language that allows us to navigate both of those tensions culturally without offending people, I think we're going to get a lot farther. Oh, and let me talk about something else while I'm at it. One of the things early on that kind of changed my mind about non-binary, for me, for a little while, I was pretty on board with transness. And I liked the freedom of, like, gender fluidity. But I didn't like non-binariness because it felt too neutral. It felt too asexual. And it also felt like the language around it was very hard to use. Some people say they, them pronouns are hard to use. I never had trouble with that part of it. But I did have trouble referring to, like, if I was on a dating app and I matched with someone who was non-binary, I would be like, oh, I matched with a cute person cute person. That's what I would say for a little while. And then when I found the word NB, that was like really, like, I was like, oh shit, yeah, there we go. Now I feel like, now it feels comfortable. Now it feels natural. You know, it's kind of like, there's language in, like, medicine that they'll use. It's like, you know what it's like? It's like when Jimmy Neutron says sodium chloride. And there's this guy who's like, he means salt? And he's like, yeah, sodium chloride. He's like, stop saying that. Say salt, you know? When you find a word that's like salt, everything feels less scary. And that's why opponents of, or critics of, transness, they emphasize terminology that is, like, scary, right? That's why they emphasize, like, you know, persons capable of giving birth, you know, or person who possesses a uterus, right? That's why they emphasize those kinds of terms, because they're a lot, they don't roll off the tongue, and if you emphasize them, then you can make the group of people behind those terms sound ridiculous. But most of the time, those terms, like people with uteruses, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time those terms are reserved for, like, paperwork and government documents, which is what they're reading off of when they get those terms. They're technical terms to avoid offending anybody. When you're in a group of people who all know they're all on the same page, about these issues politically, I'd like to think that you can get a little bit looser with the terminology than that. And also, that's why the term NB was so helpful, was because, oh, I met a cute NB, felt as natural and as easy as I met a cute girl or I met a cute guy. It felt just as easy as that. And that ease, referring to yourself as an NB, made it all feel less alien and strange. And then I saw somebody saying that apparently the term NB emerged from like the black part of the queer community originally. You know, it was queer people of color who were using the term NB first. And so no one who identifies as gender fluid or non-binary who is white should be allowed to use that word because it's cultural appropriation. So great. Great, good for us. We had something useful that made people feel more comfortable, that made us feel less completely alienating to normal persons, and we took it away because of cultural appropriation.